ChatGPT said. The sun hung merciless above the town, its glare beating down upon the single stretch of dirt road like a judgment. Heat shimmered from the boards of the saloon and the clapboard fronts of the shops, while townsfolk gathered in a restless semicircle, their whispers rising like a swarm of locusts. Children peered between skirts, men spat into the dust, and women folded their arms with the crisp sharpness of disapproval. Upon the crate before them stood Clara Mayfield, her wrists trembling against the folds of her faded calico dress, her face pale, yet burning with the kind of shame that could scald deeper than sun or fire. At her skirts clung little Annie, no more than 6, her hair wild from the heat and her eyes darting like a sparrow trapped in a cage. Clara tried to still her daughter's trembling fingers with her own, but her touch could not quiet the throb of the crowd. The marshal, broad-shouldered and red-faced with sweat, raised his voice above the mutters. Clara Mayfield, you came here under false pretenses, promised as a bride, then denied your word. This town will not bear liars without consequence. A hiss of agreement rippled through the onlookers. Clara's lips parted, but her voice caught. She had rehearsed defiance in the silence of sleepless nights, but here, under their eyes, every word turned to ash. She wanted to cry out that she was not a liar, only a woman who had been broken once too many times and could not bring herself to bind her life to a man she could not love. Yet the truth seemed smaller than the jeers. Jedediah Boone stood near the front, arms folded across his broad chest. His face was flushed not only from the sun, but from humiliation. The townsfolk laughed at him in whispers, how the fat rancher, desperate for a wife, had been spurned by a mail-order bride. His eyes, small and watchful, burned on Clara, though something in them flickered softer when they strayed to the child pressed against her legs. He said nothing. He let the town do the punishing for him. Annie's small voice reached Clara's ear. "Mama, why do they look at us like that?" Clara bent, lowering her face to her daughter's level, her tears threatening to spill. "Hush now, darling. It will be over soon." Yet she did not know if that meant mercy or ruin. The marshal banged the butt of his rifle against the crate. This woman broke her contract. This town will decide what is to be done. Who will take her? Who will see she is not a burden on our good folk? His words rang like iron. The air thickened with mockery. A man called out, "I'll take her to scrub my floors." Laughter followed. Another voice, meaner, offered, "She's not worth the feed for a mule." Clara closed her eyes, wishing for thunder to drown them out. Her hands tightened around Annie until the child whimpered. Then, silence broken by the smallest sound. Annie's voice, high and trembling, yet clear as a bell, "My papa's right there." The crowd froze, then gasped as if struck by wind. Clara opened her eyes, horrified, and followed her daughter's pointing finger. At the edge of the crowd stood Samuel Hart, tall and weathered, his shirt sleeves rolled to his elbows, a man accustomed to toil and silence. His face was unreadable, shadowed beneath the brim of his hat. "Samuel Hart?" someone muttered. "That loner. Never knew he had dealings with her," another whispered. Clara's heart thundered. She had scarcely exchanged words with Samuel beyond a nod at the well or a murmured greeting when paths crossed. He was a man the town treated like a ghost, tolerated but never embraced, living on the edge of things. Annie had scarcely seen him, and yet her little hand had risen, her voice had named him. Clara shook her head fiercely at her child, whispering, "No, Annie, no." But the damage had been done. All eyes turned on Samuel. The marshal barked, "Well, Hart, the child calls you father. Is it truth?" The man did not move for a long moment. Dust lifted in slow spirals around his boots. Clara felt the heat press closer, as though time itself held its breath. Then Samuel stepped forward, each stride deliberate, steady, until he stood before the crate. His eyes rose to Clara's, and she saw in them not accusation, nor even surprise, but a kind of weary resolve. He removed his hat, lowered his head, and held out his arms. Annie wriggled free from her mother's skirts and leapt into them, clutching his neck as though she had known him always. Clara felt the world tilt beneath her feet. The crowd erupted in murmurs. "Well, I'll be, so the girl told truth. Explains plenty, don't it? Gossip twisted faster than a rattler's strike, binding Samuel with invisible cords. He could have denied it, could have let the child's words fall to dust, but he did not. His silence was an acceptance. Jedediah Boone's mouth curled with sour satisfaction, though there was a strange hint of relief behind his glare. The marshal, eager to end the spectacle, raised his hand. So be it. Clara Mayfield and her child go with Samuel Hart. Let this matter be settled. The crate thudded as Clara stepped down, her legs unsteady. She wanted to scream, to protest that she had never once laid eyes upon Samuel in secret, that this was some mistake born of a child's desperate imagination. But Annie's face, glowing with a fragile joy against Samuel's shoulder, silenced her. To speak now would crush the hope her daughter clung to. The crowd parted as Samuel carried Annie, Clara trailing behind like a woman in a dream. Laughter and whispers followed. Guess the liar found her match. Strange folk, those two. Poor man, caught like a calf in barbed wire. The town blurred behind Clara, yet its judgment weighed heavy as an iron chain. Shame pulsed in her chest, yet mingled with it was a faint, bewildering spark, an echo of the look Samuel had given her when he held out his arms. Not pity, not anger, something quieter, steadier, like a man who had borne loneliness too long to turn from another's souls. By the time they reached the edge of town, the sun was dipping, shadows stretching long. Clara walked behind Samuel, her hands twisting in her skirts, her thoughts tangled as thornbush. She had been auctioned before the town, humiliated and branded a liar. Yet instead of ruin, she now found herself bound to a man she did not know, with her daughter's innocent claim sealing their fates. As they stepped into the silence of the open land, Clara looked once more at Samuel's back, broad and steady beneath the falling light. Her lips parted, but no words came. Annie's laughter rang softly as she whispered something into his ear, and he answered with a nod. And Clara wondered, was she being saved or merely traded again? The question tightened in her chest as the town's last echoes faded, leaving only the sound of boots in the dust and the uncertain path that stretched before them. ChatGPT said, the cabin stood at the edge of the prairie, its roof sagging slightly, boards silvered by sun and wind. Samuel pushed open the door with his boot, the hinges creaking like an old throat. Inside lay the simplicity of a man who had lived long without company. A table with one chair, a narrow bed against the wall, tools lined in silent order, dust motes drifting in the single shaft of light from the window. He set Annie down gently, and the girl immediately darted to the hearth, curious, fearless now that the crowd was gone. Clara remained in the doorway, her hands knotted in her skirts, uncertain whether she had been delivered to safety or to another kind of prison. Samuel turned, his eyes quiet, unreadable. It ain't much, he said, his voice rough from disuse. But you can stay. Clara's throat tightened. The words were not warm, not an invitation, yet there was no cruelty in them. She stepped inside, the floorboards groaning beneath her weight, and for the first time since morning she felt air that was not thick with judgment. Annie ran to the window and pressed her face against the glass, delighted by the chickens pecking outside. Clara sank onto the chair, her body trembling with exhaustion. Days slipped into one another, each carrying the hush of unspoken questions. Samuel rose before dawn, shoulders dark against the pale horizon, and returned at dusk with the weariness of long hours in the field. Clara found herself mending shirts, sweeping the floor, cooking simple meals from what Lily kept. She told herself it was only gratitude, yet each act stitched her into the fabric of his life. Annie, light as a bird, filled the silences with chatter, asking Samuel endless questions, to which he often replied with a nod or a brief phrase that somehow satisfied her. At night, when Annie curled between them on a pallet of blankets, Clara lay awake listening to the crackle of the fire and the slow, steady rhythm of Samuel's breath. She thought of the town, of the laughter that had seared her like a brand, of Jedediah Boone's heavy stare. She wondered if gossip carried even here borne on the wind like smoke. But the only sound was the coyotes calling from the hills, and in that loneliness there was a strange comfort. One evening, while Annie slept, Clara found herself alone with him at the table. The lamplight flickered across the lines of his face. She gathered courage, though her voice shook. "Why didn't you deny it? You could have said she was mistaken." Samuel looked at her for a long while, then at the lamp, as if weighing the shadows. Sometimes a child speaks what grown folk can't. Sometimes it's easier to carry a burden than to let it break somebody smaller. The words settled in her chest like stones, heavy but steadying. She wanted to ask more, whether he had ever longed for family, whether loneliness pressed on him as it did on her. But his silence told her such things were not easily spoken. Rumors did not stay buried. Clara sensed it the next time she ventured into town for flour. Conversations hushed when she passed. A woman spat near her feet. Men laughed under their breath. She lifted her chin, but shame pressed upon her shoulders. Annie clung to her hand, confused by the hostility she did not understand. When they returned to the cabin, Clara's tears fell freely. Samuel said nothing, only set the sack of flour on the table and touched her shoulder, a brief, grounding weight that spoke more than any comfort might have. The trouble deepened when Boone appeared at the homestead, riding heavy upon his horse, his boots gleaming as though polished for war. He dismounted with a grunt and leaned against the doorframe as if it were his by right. "You think you can hide her here, Hart?" His voice was thick with bitterness. "She was meant for me." Contract was signed. Clara stood frozen, Annie pressed behind her skirts. Samuel's jaw tightened. "She's not yours." Boone's laugh was low and cruel. "The town says different. You've got no claim but a child's lie." His eyes slid over Clara with disdain, then back to Samuel. "You'll regret crossing me." He left with dust trailing behind him, yet his promise hung heavier than thunder. Clara's hands shook for hours afterward. Samuel mended the door where Boone's fist had struck it, silent but intent, his brow furrowed with thought. Clara realized then that his quiet was not emptiness but restraint, a man holding back storms he'd long ago chosen not to unleash. The storm came nonetheless. Weeks later, under a sky boiling with clouds, Boone returned with 2 men from his ranch. Rain had not yet fallen, but the air smelled of iron and earth. They pounded the door, shouting for Clara to come out. Annie screamed. Samuel barred the door with his shoulder, but would splinter beneath the force of boots. The men spilled inside, rough voices filling the cabin. Boone's hand reached for Clara, his grip bruising. Samuel struck him back, the room exploding in chaos. Fists would cracking, a lamp crashing to the floor. Clara's fear burned away into a fierce clarity. She seized Samuel's rifle from the mantel. Her hands shook, her breath ragged, but she lifted the weapon and pointed it at the men. "Enough!" she cried, her voice sharp as lightning. "You'll leave us, or I swear." For a moment the world held still. The rain began to fall then, pounding the roof, as if heaven itself demanded silence. Boone stared at her, incredulous that the timid bride would defy him with steel in her hands. His men faltered, uneasy beneath her gaze. Samuel rose, blood on his lip but his stance unyielding. Boone spat into the dirt floor. "You'll regret this." With a gesture, he pulled his men back. They retreated into the storm, their curses swallowed by the rain. Clara lowered the rifle, her arms collapsing with the weight of it. Samuel caught her before she fell, his hand strong at her back. She felt his breath close to hers, both of them trembling from what had almost been lost. No words came, none were needed. Annie, sobbing, pressed herself between them, and in that fragile embrace something unspoken bound them tighter than any contract. The fire was rebuilt, the door repaired, but the night lingered like a scar. Clara sat beside Samuel as Annie slept against his chest, her small hand curled in his shirt. She studied the man who had chosen silence over denial, who had stood between her and ruin. His eyes met hers across the firelight, and for the first time, she did not look away. Yet as dawn crept pale across the horizon, a shadow stretched over Clara's heart. Boone was not a man to surrender. His pride had been wounded before the town, his threats left unfinished. Safety was a fragile thing, and love, if that was what grew here, could not shield them from what waited beyond the hills. The rooster crowed, the child stirred, and Samuel's hand lingered a moment too long upon Clara's arm. In that fleeting touch was promise, was danger, was the unspoken truth of what bound them now. And Clara knew the fight was only beginning.